It's a pleasure to see all of you here for this conversation about Cuba's special period, the legacy in the arts and culture. And to be here with these wonderful scholars, Elzbieta Sklodowska, María Cabrera, Arús, and Walfrido Dorta, some of whom are very frequent, I think, at this center. It is an honor as well to be moderating a panel with a scholar who wrote such a book. It's just incredible. I was saying that throughout my life, I've said, okay, just in a few years, maybe it means in a few years I could do such a project, I could accomplish such a thing. And I'm reading this and I said, okay, you know what? You have to say, each individual has her limits. So it's a pleasure. You have the biographies of each individual participant. So we will begin with the order, I guess, is Elzbieta first, right?
Yes, I think that's what it is. Thank you so much, Jackie. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. I'm really very touched to be here with friends and colleagues, with a wonderful audience. This book, which kind of prompted Araceli Tinajero, who's not here, but she was the spiritus movens behind the idea of getting us all together, talking kind of on the periphery and around this book. I'm originally from Poland, and my encounters with Cuba go a long way back. That was the place where I, as an exchange student from then socialist Poland, learned Spanish, or the Cuban version of Spanish, and it kind of never ended, this relationship with Cuba, still ongoing. And this book, which was a product of many years, Jackie, of off and on, so it doesn't happen as quickly as one would like, is both kind of an homage to Cuba and also to my own experience in different configurations of socialism and post-socialism. So the term special period in times of peace in Cuba is commonly interpreted both as a profound socio-economic and ideological crisis triggered in the early 1990s by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and as a metaphorical construct that permeates everyday imaginary as much as it influences artistic and literary practices. As with any such designation, the precise definition of the special period has generated its own debates and a massive bibliography, and that's, just one example because it's fairly recent. It came out in 2016 in Quattro Proprio in Chile, and to indicate how massive the bibliography is, I think it occupies about 50 pages of this book and almost 3,000 entries. So there is a lot that I also compiled from the wisdom of others. Most scholars acknowledge that the special period marks a significant juncture in Cuba's recent history and that it denotes a closed chapter in a still unfinished book of the Cuban Revolution. The special period has left in its wake an archive of works of art and literature, anecdotes, jokes, urban legends, shattered dreams, and unhealed wounds. Even today, a quarter of a century later, Cubans on the island and in the diaspora, those who lived through the crisis, as well as those who inherited in the guise of post-memory, seem to experience phantom pains at the very mention of the special period. Over the years, the special period has also undergone a commodification of its own as a commercially exploitable artifice, fossilized through the exotic iconography of decayed colonial buildings, bizarre culinary concoctions, two-hump buses nicknamed camellos, and omnipresent jineteras, peddling their services in exchange for hard-to-get goods and hard currency. However, the material traces of the crisis, and in particular, the makeshift creations typical of the special period available to scholars in today's Cuba, are not abundant, because some of them have already found homes in foreign collections, while most are still leading their useful afterlives in Cuban kitchens, offices, shops, and garages. In 1992, the New York Times journalist Lydia Chavez described Havana as a post-apocalyptic city where waste itself had become a rare commodity. And I quote from Chavez: "No gasoline meant no traffic. No trading partners meant no food. No movement or trade meant no trash. The city looked as if it had been picked clean." End of quote from Chavez. Here, a somewhat overused metaphor of a shipwreck appears to be particularly well suited for reinforcing Chavez's depiction of an island adrift, stripped to the bone of its most basic staples at a time when close to nothing was brought from the outside and most of what was produced at home was self-made. In order to be a consumer, an average Cuban had to become a producer. This shortage of artifacts notwithstanding, inspired by Bjørnar Olsen's manifesto in defense of things, I propose to focus more specifically on some of the material traces of the 1990s, realizing that the real challenge to the scholarship about the special period consists in not relapsing into the self-evident or replaying the complexity of the crisis into a narrow bandwidth of seductive cliches. From their position on the periphery of free market economy, commonplace objects in revolutionary Cuba had always enjoyed an extended lifespan before being upcycled as antiquarian memorabilia, collector's items, and primary material for artful transformations, or, in the least likely scenario, disposed of as garbage. The special period intensified the onslaught of home-produced reinventions and in the long run reinforced the image of Cuba as a do-it-yourself society, as recently demonstrated by the PBS-sponsored photo essay distributed under a distinctly patronizing title, "The Bizarre, Brilliant, and Useful Inventions of Cuban Do-It-Yourself Engineers." Chavez's quote about the Havana of the 1990s being picked clean should make it clear that a hypothetical curator of an exhibit on the special period would have to make do with a very limited archive of objects, while at the same time having at his or her disposal myriad narratives to script such a display. There's no museum of the special period in Cuba, and the two rooms on the ground floor of Havana's flagship Museum of the Revolution, dedicated to the most recent history, have a distinct feel of a temporary installation. It is curious, but probably unintended, that the provisional character of this sparse exposition resonates, and here I use the terminology from Stephen Greenblatt, resonates with the spirit of thrift and improvisation that defined daily existence during the special period. The day-to-day experience of grappling with drastic scarcity reveals two facets of the materiality of the special period. On one hand, the astonishing everyday creativity inspired by the lack of resources, el arte de inventar y resolver. And on the other, the despair and humiliation triggered by the abject misery of the struggle for survival, la lucha. With all proportions being guarded, shipwrecked Cubans face the same challenges as Robinson Crusoe, who upon his dreadful deliverance from the sinking ship had nothing about him, and I quote, but a knife, a tobacco pipe, and a little tobacco in a box, end of quote, and nonetheless managed to conjure up wonders out of minimal resources and survive. In No hay que llorar, One Shouldn't Cry, a volume of heartbreaking testimonies compiled by Aristides Vega Chapu in 2011, the memories of the 1990s are captured through glimpses of familiar materiality. One witness recalls tearing up books to light a fire for cooking. Others remember trading in precious family heirlooms for a chunk of meat. In light of Olson's observations about the two-way dynamic in human-thing relations, these examples depict the creative refunctioning of things, but they also reveal how objects reconstruct the subject. For these witnesses, the act of having to use a valuable artifact in order to satisfy a basic biological need turns into a humiliating instance of regression of the revolutionary subject, Che Guevara's Hombre Nuevo, from the utopia of socialist modernity to the decidedly anti-modern backwardness. It is indeed in the sphere of materiality that the experience of the special period appears most tangibly incongruous with the modernizing project of the revolution. In a startling twist, what stereotypically serves as a synecdoche for post-Soviet Cuba is not what was made during the revolution, but rather what was destroyed. In a deluge of travelogues, photographs, and films, the decaying buildings of Havana stand as ghostly sentinels to the wreckage of Soviet-enabled socialism. There's no denying that the ruins of Havana are part and parcel of the history of Cuban Revolution. The economic crisis of the 1990s certainly precipitated the deterioration of many structures already teetering on the brink of collapse. But systematic restoration also gained momentum in the mid-1990s in conjunction with the shift towards foreign tourism. Consequently, the body of evidence of the special period is hardly synonymous with the corpus delicti of a ruin. In a jarring juxtaposition, the painstakingly salvaged mansions, monasteries, churches, and squares of colonial Havana belong to the post-Soviet era as much as the open entrails of hundreds of buildings that still surround the postcard-like artifice of Plaza Vieja. It is far from obvious what awaits those willing to probe beyond and underneath the facade of post-Soviet materiality in Cuba. The limits and limitations of the actual archive represent enough of a hurdle, but the pitfalls of folklorization might be even more challenging. As I flip through the crumbling pages of El Libro de la Familia, family book, and Con nuestros propios esfuerzos, algunas experiencias para enfrentar el periodo especial en tiempos de paz, with our own efforts and experiences to face the special period in time of peace, released respectively in 1991 and 1992 by Verde Olivo, the publishing house of Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. I appreciate the dual archival value of both books. In it by itself, each is an artifact from the special period, and at the same time, a documentary source about that era. Whereas El Libro de la Familia is a compendium of survivalist strategies devised by military experts, Con nuestros propios esfuerzos describes and illustrates in technical detail an array of artifacts, recipes, and techniques actually invented or self-produced by the population and collected from all over the island by local authorities, regardless of the fact that some proposals, such as horse-drawn funeral vehicles converted into ambulances or windmills adapted to pump water, were never implemented. Together, El Libro de la Familia and Con nuestros propios esfuerzos can be seen as a tribute to the creativity and the resilience of Cuban people. At the same time, we can hardly overlook the fact that the project was a brainchild of the military, which deployed the survival strategies designed for the time of war in order to mobilize local authorities into action and tap the spontaneous inventiveness of the population at large in times of peace. But sitting as I am in my office on a university campus in the US, I'm also acutely aware of everything that separates me from the actual experience invoked by these books. The tortuous and parallel paths that led to the acquisition of each of these publications, enabled by research funds and my ability to travel to Cuba, also remind me about the wisdom behind the ancient saying that books have their own fates, while unsurprisingly confirming my suspicion that recovering the material traces of the special period is governed by the combined forces of randomness, serendipity, and privilege. It was up to the editors of Verde Olivo to make sure that these inventions were embedded in a nationalist rather than socialist-inflected rhetoric. The term criollo, used throughout these publications to describe artifacts and recipes, is meant to evoke the resourcefulness of the Mambises, fighters for Cuban independence, and the defiant ingenuity of cimarrones, runaway slaves. Con nuestros propios esfuerzos upholds the myth of Cuban exceptionality by embedding the inventions of the special period within the tradition of a nation that claims to be unique at least on two counts: its ethno-cultural hybridity and its heroic, rebellious spirit. It is as if the revolutionary regime had to look back and inward in order to move forward. Many of the artifacts of the special period pictured in the pages of Con Nuestros Propios Esfuerzos can be found in the physical and virtual archives assembled by Cuban artists, now based in Florida for the most part, Ernesto Orosa, who traveled across the island in the early 1990s, gathering objects as diverse as lanterns made of glass containers and toothpaste tubes, shoes crafted from melted plastic bags, or fans propelled by motors extracted from Soviet washing machines. For a wistful observer from a country overflowing with mass-produced goods, it is tempting to view these artifacts, Cuban, Soviet, post-Soviet, through the prism of their rustic charm, or conversely, as a future-oriented alternative to the fatal flow of planned obsolescence inscribed in the logic of late capitalism. It will take time before ordinary Cubans appropriate or adapt myriad discourses of low-tech sustainability and begin perceiving the arguments about measured frugality of make, do, and mend, not as an emergency measure or a whim born out of capitalist overabundance, but as a long-term mandate for their own communities. Meanwhile, those of us doing scholarly work on Cuba, outside Cuba, need to be more aware of ways in which we are cropping and retouching these artifacts in order to make them fit the preconceived frames of our methodological, institutional, or ideological allegiances. This self-awareness is not about raising some sense of guilt for us, the privileged, but rather about following Olson's suggestion that these things should not be treated as subaltern members of a community. As we weave narratives, such as this one, around competing discourses of commercialization and nostalgia, uniqueness and globalization, exoticism and alternative modernities, let us paraphrase Walter Benjamin and perhaps find further inspiration in the idea that traces of the special period will always cling to the objects left in its wake, like, and here I quote Benjamin, the way the handprints of the potter cling to a clay vessel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Elzbieta, for inviting us to share some thoughts on your book and on the special period on Cuban materiality, and thank you all for being here today. The Cuba of the special period is generally represented as and associated with the idea of a society frozen in time, or, as literary critic José Quiroga has noted in his book Cuban Palimpsests, as a country out of time or on a time of its own. Rundown buildings of modernist and pre-modernist and colonial architecture, rusty vintage North American automobiles, horse cars crossing empty urban streets, including those of the capital city, insipid meals prepared in kerosene stoves, eaten under the dim light of a too expensive, too hard to obtain, too artless candle or kerosene lamps, surely contributed to give foreign visitors and academics the idea that everyday life in Cuba had little changed during the decades of state socialist administration. Generally, foreign academics and Cuban nationals associate the last decades in the country, actually the history of the late 20th century in Cuba, with two principal divides. One divide, located on January 1st, 1959, separates the pre-revolutionary era from the revolutionary one, declared socialist in 1961. The other separates more blurrily the 3 decades of mostly Soviet-style socialism from the special period, an epoch itself that never concluded, not officially, more or less smoothly dissolving into the present. These two watersheds produce different befores and afters, which contemporary Cubans recognize with ease, without ignoring the cultural continuities that stretch along this line and across the divides. The academic community, however, has been less enthusiastic in recognizing the extent of social dynamics that persist along the more than 5 decades of Cuban post-revolutionary history. Many Cubanists have actually approached the present of the Cuban present as an autonomous universe, disconnected from its most immediate past, the special period, and even more from the decades of Soviet-style socialism that preceded the special period. Literary critic Jacqueline pioneered an approach that studies the present through the traces that the Soviet past has left on it. In many ways, the research agendas of the panelists gathered here, and quite remarkably, Elzbieta Sklodowska's book Invento, Luego Resisto, El Periodo Especial en Cuba como Experiencia y Metáfora, are faithful to this legacy of searching for continuities in a history that usually places too much weight on its own divides. After all, it is not possible to fabricate ruins in just a few days, unless you are a rich English aristocrat. My academic research in particular focuses on the years of Soviet-style socialism in the country, which I claim is a way to understand both the special period and the present. I studied the politics of material culture during the 3 decades that extend between the triumph of the Cuban Revolution and the declaration of the special period in times of peace, as it was officially called, the crisis that followed the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe and the disintegration of the USSR. I paid particular attention to the realms of fashion and domestic space, outlining both the continuities and ruptures between periods that appear otherwise fractured in the national imaginary and in a great chunk of academic research. I always like to illustrate this with a personal story. Actually, I think in 1980, a family friend who returned from visiting her relative in the United States brought me a t-shirt with the word California written in the front, in glittering red letters. And I have the t-shirt here for you to see. I love it, and I like it to wear it. As it was a previous t-shirt I had. Yet, in spite of how badly I like it, I don it covered in the glittering word across my chest by crossing my arms. Hiding the word California, I thought, would prevent me from being perceived as a counter-revolutionary. In 1993, the Cuban government legalized the circulation of US dollars and promoted tourism and visits from the Cuban exile community in the US. The border that separated the nation and the exile grew more permeable, and clothing merchandise with foreign names or North American brands anathematized in the previous decades became commonplace. When my father sent me a t-shirt with the moniker Channel embroidered in golden letters in the front, much like the California t-shirt of my youth, it never occurred to me to hide the word. I even happily attended to classes at the University of Havana, clad in my Chanel t-shirt. The attractive of foreign printed t-shirts and the practice of importing them from the US had little changed in a decade. Yet the meanings of these outfits did actually evolve, sometimes to extremes barely recognizable. To understand these dynamics, we have to go back to the years that followed the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. Back then, the transformation of material culture and the meanings of material culture helped the new regime to represent a radical break with the past. the expropriation of luxurious estates and the repurposing as boarding schools, state ministries, and museums, just to name some of the functions they were used to, for instance, and the promotion of styles and traditions associated with the peasantry and industrial or manual work. Groups, the workers, arguably less contaminated by foreign influences and sumptuous consumption than cosmopolitan upper classes and urban residents, helped to create a new figure of power based on the values of egalitarianism, nationalism, and industrialization and modernization. Industrialization and modernization acquired particular relevance with Cuba's rapprochement with the Soviet Union and the country's admission in 1972 into COMECON, the Economic Organization for Cooperation of Soviet bloc countries. As we can see in the 1975 series of peso bill, the state summoned a material culture and the visual iconography to convey the idea that Cuba was on a path to definitive industrial development and economic progress. This series featured an industrial complex instead of the scene of the entrance of Fidel Castro's caravan in Havana on January 6, 1959, which had been printed in the back of the 1 peso bill since 1961. This was the former peso bills. They printed this series in 1975, and they quickly turned back to this one afterwards, a few years later, in 1988. Cubans, officials suggested, could finally look forward to a modern society and to the end of the rationing of most goods in the near future. A representational world of material symbolism helped to bridge the gap between present and future circumstances. Fashion brochures and women's magazines featured sketches of modern clothes never sold in Cuban stores. Also included were cropped images from Eastern European magazines, featuring non-tropical garments such as scarves, gloves, and hats made from fabrics like corduroy, polyester, and wool not suitable for tropical climates. Labels and brands also denoted an imagined future of socialist progress and modernization. With its logo featuring an atom, the clothing brand Futura conjured up a future characterized by applied science and technology. Similarly, Orbita, which means orbit, and Cometa, which means comet, labels, no, I don't have that, sorry, reference space age terms and the Soviet space program. In these and other ways, the Sovietized 70s taught citizens to measure the revolution's evolving claims to legitimacy in the previous verboten territory of mass consumer goods. Materials, crafts, logos, and brand names explicitly connoting Cubanness acquired new symbolic significance as avatars of local values and lore. In the 1970s, the guayabera shirt, valorized for its nationalist symbolism, was transformed by designers employed by state enterprises into a feminine dress. By the end of the decade, the state produced women's and children's clothing collections based on this style. Nods to local objects, traditions, and terms could also be found in the brand names tagged onto newly mass-manufactured goods, some of them unmistakably produced with Soviet technology and parts. For instance, in clothing labels like Agro, a reference to agriculture, and Yarey, the fiber from a palm-like plant that Cuban peasants used to make straw hats, and the brand for locally assembled gifts Montuno, and appealing to the rural world and Cuban nationalist mythologies, we see the combination of nationalist discourses and foreign technology or aesthetics. Other fashion labels like Hiqui, the aboriginal name of a Cuban tree, Criolla or Creole, and Caiman or alligator, whose shape arguably resembles that of the island of Cuba as a whole, drew upon aboriginal words and elements from Cuba's nationalistic folklore. The royal palm tree adorned the logo of Caribe brand TV sets and C1A radios, both borrowing their names from aboriginal groups, as also did the Taíno portable radio, which featured an image of the wooden dubo chair used by pre-Columbian indigenous chiefs. Apart from domesticating the Soviet influence, these monikers reconcile consumerist and nationalistic discourses.
Official investment in egalitarian anti-capitalist principles also reverberated in the appearance of brand names and labels associated with popular culture and grassroots solidarity. This is the case of the clothing lines Unión or Union, and Festival, the word for popular celebrations, and in the brand for portable radios, Pionero, which referenced members of the Soviet-inspired mass organization for school children. This extensive list of examples illustrates that from store displays to design aesthetics, state actors in the fashion and consumer sectors strategically parsed and navigated tensions drawing on multiple, often incongruous conceptions of consumption and materiality. Valorizing Cuba's traditional cultural heritage on the one hand and celebrating its modern socialist future on the other, touting egalitarianism while also sanctioning new kinds of individual material distinction. By the time the regime entered its third decade in power, the Cuban material landscape heralded an affluent future, while also looking to nationalist and egalitarian values. In their conjunctions and contradictions, the revised material practices of the 70s and 80s gave origin to a multi-referential symbolic repertoire, with room for both regime officials and ordinary citizens to strategically activate different discourses at the same time. And then, state socialism collapsed, the Soviet Union disintegrated, and Cuba entered the special period. And my research stopped. A different cabinet of curiosity, to borrow from Elzbieta's title, began to take shape, eventually dismantling and wearing out the state socialism culture from the previous 3 decades. Since 2012, I've been archiving the latter, the Cuban socialist material culture, in the website Cuba Material, in an intent to preserve what will quite soon exist only in few and scattered published testimonies. Cuba Material is both a virtual and a physical collection of objects, memorabilia, spaces, architecture, artifacts, food containers, works of literature and art in which this materiality is represented. And also I collect and publish online stories of their uses and meanings, including information on the design, production, and commercialization of goods when this information is available. The archive and collection mostly cover the period between the triumph of the Cuban Revolution and the collapse of state socialism in Eastern Europe and the disintegration of the USSR, although some information from the pre-revolutionary past and the special period is also included. However, filling up the cabinet of curiosities with which Cubans entered the special period is also part of the process of understanding the special period in itself. These objects communicate the origins of many of the material and social dynamics that people develop to cope with the crisis: hoarding, bricolage, do-it-yourself, just to name a few, including the processes defined by designer artist Ernesto Rosa as technological disobedience, just mentioned by Elzbieta. None of them exclusive of the special period. There are countless examples of this, of the idea that these processes extend back into the past, before the special period, including the Chivichana or rustic skateboard. The very own preservation of all this is a Chivichana exhibited in a show that I curated in 2015, and it was brought from Cuba in 2015, but this is an image of a Chivichana used in 1973, and it's the same object. And it's made by hand and with recycled wood by Cuban parents or children. The very own preservation of all the objects of the Cuban material collection until the present, the fact that they have survived the crisis of the special period and its aftermath, constituting itself a coping mechanism, as it is also a coping mechanism, their nostalgic evocation and remembrance in the blogosphere. It was not just a fortunate decision of my parents not to get rid of my California t-shirt. They saved it for my children, or for whomever could eventually need it. Scarcity and economic crisis are the main causes of the long durée cycles in which these objects were caught. On the other hand, what can be defined as practices of necessity, and this is a concept I take from Ernesto Rosa, developed to satisfy the permanent search for modernity and fashion, can also be traced back to the pre-special period era. Zulu, a brand of leather handbags and goods produced in Cuba right now by a family business with a 25-year tradition, recreates patches as their principal decoration and characteristic. This economic solution to the crisis of the special period originated in the need to use the leftovers of Cuba's footwear industry, and now is sole seal of distinction. Their techniques of production, however, date from even further into the past. This family learned how to make shoes and handbags from a relative who worked at one of the state shoe factories in the 1980s. An ID authorizing Cuban nationals to fish at sea, Carnet de Pesca Deportiva or Sport Fishing ID, obtained with relative ease in the 1980s, was highly coveted during the special period by those who wanted to reach the US coast to obtain permanent residency. Another ID, encouraging citizens to secretly spy on their neighbors, demonstrates the role of the Cuban government encouraging citizens to inform on each other, a practice that extends almost from 1959 to the present. The digital news site Café Fuerte has just published a document last week distributed to taxi drivers with a specific instructions on how and what to report on the passengers' conversations. The material culture of Cuban socialism is gradually being dismantled. Cubans are getting rid of their useless today diplomas and certificates of political merit, outdated appliances, rag clothes, and IDs from the Cold War era and the special period, those that can afford to change, to renovate this material culture, of course. They are being slowly replaced by the glossy new products of the contemporary globalized capitalist market. Without the cabinet of curiosities of Cuba material, we won't be able to document and understand the mechanism of socialization, domination, accommodation, consent, and dissent developed during the post-revolutionary era, the Soviet years, and the special period. This is to say, we won't be able to know where are we coming from with Cubans and where are we going. How would we know then that for Cubans, Icarus was not a mythological creature, but a Hungarian boss that rode along Cuban streets before the horse cars of the special period appeared, and that black beans were sold not in bulk like they are sold today, but in fancy packaging. Thank you.
Thanks, Elzbieta, for the invitation and being a center for organizing the panel. For me, it's kind of coming back to my home because I work here for 3-4 years, I think, and I work with Mauricio, Elba, and several other people. It's really a pleasure. I have published some articles on this Diaspora's journal, but I will address today the materiality of the journal and how we can read it today in the context of the Cuban special period. The Diaspora's group began its activities in Havana in 1993 as an alternative writing project. From this date until 1997, it developed readings, performances, and public interventions at conferences and cultural events. In 1997, it began to publish the homonymous journal until 2002. Among its members are Orlando Sánchez Mejías, Carlos Aguilera, Pedro Marquez, Ricardo Pérez, Rogelio Sanders, Ismael González Castañer, Radamés Molina, and José Manuel Prieto. Since its beginning, the magazine was marked by the absence in Cuba of Sánchez Mejías, who left the country in 1997. Molina had already left Cuba in 1993, Sanders would leave in 1998, Prieto joined the magazine from Mexico, his base since 1995. Therefore, Diasporas incarnated early on some of the postulates that informed it as a group. The exteriority by which it advocated in various ways was sustained by its own members, converted into a diaspora of multiple points, only a few at the beginning, then multiplied by 2002, when nearly all of its members had left Cuba. The activity of diasporas takes place in the context of the special period. The special period, as scholars like Ariana Hernandez Rewan or Elzbieta Sklodowska in her excellent book Invento Lo Resisto have pointed out, is a category of experience rather than a historical convention. Everything that the special period brought with it drastically changed the physical, ethical, and effective landscape of the island. In those years, particular perceptions of time were reinforced, and José Quiroga proposes an expanded present, he says, which is not a transition, but, quote, a period of uncertainty that is still meant to connect to the future while suspending the time between the two temporal dimensions, end of quote. Almost everything is capitalized in Cuban life in that period, not only the material side of society, but also affection, work, and time. In the 90s, the sites of enunciation of Cuban literature multiplied, not only because many authors emigrated, but because some authors who lived on the island began publishing in foreign publishers, mainly Spanish ones. It was the beginning of the inscription of the literary brand Cuba on the international market, which brought certain economic empowerment to the writers. This consolidated the identitarian exoticism and increasing demands of witnessing related to this exoticization linked to what Esther Whitfield called the post-Soviet exotic or the special period exotic, essential elements of the new Cuban literary boom. We can understand diasporas against this background of incipient then accentuated mercantilization of Cuban literature in the strange circumstances of the special period. Diasporas shows the margin and strategy of war against the institutional framework and especially against the state or against the fictions that it produces about the literary canon and national identity. It aimed at developing a politics of literature without messianism. The project and the journal defied the prohibitions on the circulation of archives in the Cuban cultural field. It carried out a critique of what they understood at that time as totalitarianism and the construction of the national literary canon and narratives about identity. Diasporas put in crisis the state paradigms on national literature, certain models of poetry and narrative, and the relationship between writer and state in Cuba. The disruptive nature of diaspora's interventions, whether in its performances, readings, or participation in cultural events, and they are daring to function as an autonomous group, provoked the eventual closure of public spaces where their actions were tolerated for a few years. They were even denied an attempt to publish a dossier with the text of the group in a national journal. They could only be published in a dispersed way, thus the existence of an autonomous group could not be officially validated. The creation of the journal Diasporas is in part consequence of this closing of the possibility of a public eruption. However, rather than as an effect of the forced withdrawal, the journal could be seen as the opening of the group's intellectual politics. And beyond, the journal was a dangerous endeavor for its protagonists in the midst of the devastation of the special period. To create a journal not affiliated with an institutional framework or not financed by the state to reproduce it and distribute it is penalized in Cuba. This prohibition was of an analogical nature in the mid-90s. It still remains, but today digital reproduction makes it more difficult to enforce this prohibition today. In the midst of a shortage of material resources of the special period, aware of the proscription of an endeavor of this kind, Diaspora's members began to make the journal in 1997. The conscience of transgression did not prevent them from printing in each issue, on the reverse side of the journal's cover, the addresses and phones of Orlando Sanchez Mejias at issue number 1 and Carlos Aguilera from issue number 2. You can see at the end of the pages the addresses and phones of these persons. I think this was a brave gesture that is better understood if the restrictive conditions in which the magazine was produced are taken into account. Pedro Marquez argues that Sanchez Mejias inspired the journal. He and Aguilera edited the first issue, the number 1. Marquez and Aguilera are in charge at the time that Sanchez Mejias left the country in 1997, who collaborates with them from Barcelona. They copy the text into a computer, ask for collaborations and translations. Without the state sponsorship, the reproduction of the journal is one of the most difficult steps to achieve. They come to the photocopy as a means of reproduction. They were able to make about 50 copies of each number, mainly thanks to the bribery of people in state institutions. The scarcity of editions affects the physical extent of the distribution of the journal, of course. In this sense, the copies of the journal Diasporas are part of the material legacy of a special period that Elzbieta studies in her recent book mentioned above. They are in some way artifacts self-produced during those years, like those that she analyzes. I mean, these are not survival artifacts, but artistic or literary artifacts self-produced during the special period of years. The production of the journal is linked to the several practices of struggle, la lucha, such as the illegal diversion of state assets, the so-called desvío de recursos, as Elzbieta points out also in her book. Some suspicion and fear within the later Cuban community affected the reception of the journal because it wasn't affiliated with institutions and was produced outside the state. Aguilera talks in an interview about the cold and fearful reception that diasporas often provoked of how the members of the group tried to provide the journal to a number of writers and perceived the discomfort that this brought. The journal was seen as, quote, necessary but useless, since it wasn't placed within that self-celebrated production that has been repeated in Cuban literature, end of quote from Aguilera, and because the other writers did not know what to do with the journal. However, the precariousness of the journal's production and its very materiality did not guarantee the periodicity proper to the institutional circulation nor a stable reception. So what I call diasporic politics has to do also with the modes of production, reproduction, and circulation of the journal. The intention of its creators was the greatest dissemination possible in spite of the material restrictions. The existence of an original was deferred by photocopied reproduction. The aura of the single object, which would have later allowed a certain way of making the journal into an archive, is blocked by the differences of the copies from each other. As Aguilera explains, an original wasn't kept. Each member kept his copy, but there were no originals, since the idea was to be photocopied in all possible places. Hence, some copies were poorly photocopied, or there are people who remember them red or blue, when in fact everything was done in white and black. But if someone later photocopied the number on blue paper, so the number was blue. So it is almost impossible to establish a single color or a single form of archiving these objects today because of their former way of reproduction. Diaspora's members oriented these conditions of production and diffusion in spite of not being ideal towards their conceptual goals. Their intention was not to make a journal according to the material guarantees that would grant state support, although it must be said that these guarantees were minimal in the special period, as we know, in terms of design, conception, or regularity. Nor did they want to affiliate these photocopied objects to an idea of a journal like the ones that prevail in Cuba, an editorial politics which is panoramic, inclusive, non-distinctive, constructed from a forced democracy criteria that nullified the controversy. Seen today, the copies of diasporas are objects marked by the precariousness inherent to the 90s in Cuba and the special period. However, at a technical and visual level, the journal was innovative because it was a collection of sheets composed electronically by computer, printed and photocopied in black and white, when generally texts in Cuba were typed and printed traditionally. The design for the journal was made by the artist Tania Bruguera, as were the works that appear on the front and back cover of issue number 1 in 1997. Bruguera is not credited as author of the works or of the design. The artist's name did not appear out of fear, as she considered the project quite a risky one. She decided not to put her name on the first issue of Diaspora. She told me that in a personal communication. The poor, originally monochrome materiality of these copies contrasts with the intellectual intensity unfolding within them. It is the same contrast that occurs when one thinks of the obstinacy of a group of writers and artists in creating an autonomous intellectual space amidst scarcity, like in the case of the Azotea or Reina María Rodriguez in the 90s. The intensity also permeates the works of art used as front and back covers in Diaspora's journal, all by Cuban artists. Through them, the project also unfolds its transgressions. In the issue number 2 from 1998 appeared the works Animales Peligrosos and El Encierro by Rafael Zarza, both of 1971. The human figure is absent from these somber paintings in which animality is exposed as monotony and seriality. An interview with Zarza, published in this issue, offers a key to the understanding of some of the works. The two paintings are the result of the atmosphere of 25 or 30 years ago, according to the painter. Thus, the second issue of Diasporas opens part of the visual archive of the so-called Quinquenio Gris in the 70s, an era known for its rigid guidelines on cultural policy on Cuba. Zarza's balls, with skeletal faces bordered on life and death, are signs of the moment of cultural immobility. I painted the figure of a bull leading the mass or the figure of cattle fleeing without knowing exactly their meaning, when there are totalitarianism, fascism is there in the air, and one doesn't have to look far to find it, Rafael Zarza says. In another moment of the conversation with the painter, there is an interesting revision of the art of the 1980s, which are usually narrated from the celebration of the insurrection of the young artists and the creative opening. These other works, Rafter, Agony and Hope, and 86.5 Days Journey by Cuban-American artist Luis Cruz Azaceta, appeared in issue 3 in 1998. With them, Diaspora circulates several images that couldn't have otherwise been disseminated because Cruz Azaceta was not, and is still not at present, allowed to exhibit his work on the island. The work of this painter, in exile from the country since 1970, converges with Diaspora's intellectual politics in several senses. Cruz Azaceta is an artist of continuous exodus, as Iván de la Nuez argues, whose diasporic condition manifests itself not from exilic nostalgia, but from the awareness that living in the diaspora means not having a permanent refuge. The diaspora doesn't mean a transit between one country and another, but a status without a country or flags. The meanings of Cruz Azaceta's works speak of a post-human condition, displacement, alienation, uprooting, loneliness, exclusion, renunciation, and silence. On the other hand, Cruz Azaceta has refused to appear on the art scene of the United States as a member of labels such as Latino. That is, he refuses to be understood from a politics of subaltern identity. He asserts his condition of painter without adjective. Cruz Azaceta's works, published by Diasporas, though they have universal connotation that refer to the displacement or exile of any subject, are disruptive because they focus on the figure of the raptor, the balsero, who is an essential element of this painter's work. Just 3 years earlier, in 1994, Cuba had suffered one of its biggest migratory crises with the massive exodus of hundreds of balseros. The publication of these paintings wants to influence of images about these recent events. In this sense, there is a close relationship between Cruz Azaceta's work and Diasporas in terms of the prohibition of circulation of some archives and images, the rupture with its banning, the diasporic and exiled without pathos, the posthuman condition, and the resistance to identitarian representation. The journal also shows for its front and back covers the works of 2 young artists in the 90s, Eduardo Zarza Girola in 1999 and Ezequiel Suarez for issue number 6. Zarza Girola's skeletons are at the center of Fil de Estreno and Jefa de Destacamento, both from 1998. These artist drawings point to the disturbing and ghostly temporality of a special period, according to Marta Hernandez Alban in her book Minimal Cuba. These works are closely related to the extreme circumstances of the island. Jefa de Destacamento, second one, makes a group of children pioneros in schools and thus questions the luminous image of the future that the pioneros represent in the revolutionary imaginary. Living Death collapses this future and provokes an expanded present which is immobile in its suspension. Zarza Girola filled its drawings of homogenized, depersonalized living death, similar to Rafael Zarza's bulls from previous issues. He puts in the foreground the unproductive, the dead face of beings and things. The unproductive, the dead, the grotesque, the horror, and the ridiculous together will appear in various ways in the discourses of diasporas. The Untitled Works by Ezequiel Suarez for issue number 6, as well as those by Carlos M. Luis for issues 7 and 8, have already completely displaced the human figure. In the black and white monochrome of the first and final pages of the journal appear figures that resemble aliens in a sidereal landscape or totems of empty sockets. There are also landscapes that cover the entire length of the page in a suffocating overflow. There is a great oil stain in with 3 words: oil is here, petróleo está aquí, struggle to appear, becoming almost illegible, or abstract strokes of a digital post-impressionist pointillism. I'm concluding. How to overcome the scarcity of material resources, how to put it to work in order to circulate all these discourses and images produced and assembled from the margin. This was the commitment of members of diasporas. The thresholds of the images of each issue of the journal promise what will be developed inside with equal intensity. The introduction of censor archives, the thinking about totalitarianism, the putting into crisis of identitarian representation, and the centrality of the human, the primacy of the dead, and the illegible before the transparent. The disruptive politics of diasporas is an essential part of the cultural imaginary of the Cuban special period, of its intensity and of its poverty. Thank you.
And before this, I wanted to say sin manteca, pero con dignidad, because today is the 1st of May, right? And one of the most, I mean, there's just so many remarkable details in Elzbieta's book. And there's many places where you feel that, you know, she's recuperating and has like long and very, not just lists, but with incredible critical reflections of refranes. And that was just one of them, and since today is, in fact, May 1st, we must say it. So a question for everyone. I immensely learned from your work, learned from your panel, and I did have a question that the other day in Ruth Behar and Richard Bianco's blog, Bridges to Cuba, Anna Kushner, who's the translator of, among other works, by La Padura, discussed her relationship to scarcity. She's a Cuban-American exile, right, of a child of exiles. And she talked about what the kind of strategies that she used as a child growing up in Miami to understand exile. And one of the things that she said is she needed to sort of really hold on to the narrative of scarcity and pain in order to cope with her own family's having left the island. So I wanted to ask you all, what is it that we gain achieve as scholars to continue to return to this period and to a conversation that deals with scarcity? So, and that's one question, and I can the other question that I have is also for everyone. And one of my favorite, another of my favorite aspects of Elzbieta's book deals with her own telling about her relationship to her intellectual trajectory, which is immensely rich. Her writing, there's a point in this book in which she talks about testimonial, the genre of testimonial, which was so important to critical reflections in the 1980s and 1990s especially. And I wanted, so what is the effect? Okay, so I've noticed that, especially María Antonia comes from sociology, and we have literary critics here. And María Antonia's, when you talked about me, you talked about a literary critic, but of course is my formation. So what is it about the special period that sort of transforms our relationship to our disciplines? And those are the two questions for everyone, and then we'll talk about that, and then I have a couple of individual questions. Do you want to start? You want the first one?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Jackie, and you, fellow co-panelists, for the tremendous intellectual generosity in sharing and commenting and reading critically, but at the same time with great generosity. And I would like to acknowledge the debts that I actually have with all of you. Jackie has been literally the pioneer and blazing the trail for the post-Soviet and Soviet traces in Cuba. And that work is just absolutely fundamental for all of us who came afterwards. The amazing reach, and at the same time for me, belonging to a different generation that does not blog and does not do all these amazing things on the internet, what Maria Antonia has done is a resource that is just beyond really description. When you say blog, it's just absolutely much more than that. And is so enriching, and at the same time so critically conceived that it's not just a collection of random items, and that has been an inspiration for me. And the work, the archival, the tedious, the detailed work done with diasporas, which is actually, something that requires hours and hours and weeks and months of, I imagine, intellectual sleuthing. And then it comes together, and it's, again, a tremendous gift to all of us, especially coming from colleagues who, unlike me, are at the beginning of their careers, when the push to produce, to publish, in order not to perish, and at the same time, the temptation to cut corners is obvious. And there's no cutting corners in the work of my colleagues here. So I'm actually very grateful, very proud, and very honored to be part of this configuration. Very briefly, in terms of scarcity, I think that it's just on and on my personal narrative, kind of transposing itself into what I read about and write and do with the special period. When I first came to the United States in 1980, and it was a Poland that was at that time fairly affluent, during the very brief window of opportunity when Solidarity government was in place. That's why they let me out. And I went back when the martial law had already instituted itself. And I will never forget the first encounter with the US supermarket. It was before the era of the internet, so I didn't have a clue what a supermarket looked like. And I felt really like Eve in paradise looking at these beautiful apples, and I wanted to buy them all. And I bought a few, and the first bite sent me back into some, just completely surreal experience. They didn't taste like anything. They didn't taste like apples. And I had this tremendous nostalgia for these very kind of inconspicuously looking Polish apples, but still tasting like apples. And then during the martial law in Poland, where I couldn't even make a call to Poland because all the contacts of the lines were cut, but you still could send kind of humanitarian packages. And I was a graduate student, didn't have much money, and I remember that one of the things that was obvious that was very needed and not perishable was detergent. So I started sending detergent by ship. You could send things by ship. It took about 6 months, but it arrived and was cheap. So, it was just kind of lived, and all these contrasts and the sense of guilt when you feel like you're surrounded by this incredible overabundance, and at the same time, maybe not in today's Poland, not my family, but other people elsewhere suffering from the lack of the very basic stuff. So I think that it is important to kind of have, without imposing it too much, a sense of personal, both ethical responsibility and somehow, at the end of the day, it's probably a catharsis too. It's a selfish exercise because you exercise your guilt through writing. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Elzbieta, for your very kind words. I think that I can answer both of your questions with inside the same answer, because in my case, both the special period and the scarcity, or the restoration scarcity and the special period, means trying to establishing connections with and continuities alongside Cuban history, and trying to see how, because on January the 2nd or on February 1959, the Cuban culture continued to be the same and as it was in 1958, and Cubans continued to behave more or less the same. They started dressing with olive green fatigues, but apart from that, it was life continued the same. And between the pre-special period era and the post-special period, again, we inherited the same behavior, the same language. So it's kind of looking at what is underneath these abrupt ruptures and breaks in Cuban history, recent history. And as a way to understand where are we coming from and where are we going to, also, and this is something that in which I've begun to think after I created the Cuban Material Archive, the idea of preserving, because history shows that the Cuban Soviet style socialism ended in 1990. So a special period also ended at some point, unprecisely fixed. So what is gonna happen with future generations, writers, scholars like us that have to take pains to find evidence, archival sources, information on the periods we are studying? There have to be a reservoir, a repository, some sources of information in which how everyday life in Cuba occur, with instrument did we write, what dress we use. So that this is my interest in the special period on that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elzbieta, for your words. I think from about the first question from you, Jacqueline, what we gain from coming back to the special period, I think it's essential. And it is one of the reasons that Elzbieta's books it is important and will be more important within a few years. I would say that the special period was the undesired and unexpected revolution within revolution. With an undesired and unexpected revolution within revolution. Because, it changed radically all of social relationships in Cuba. There was the introduction, as you know, of the dollarization of the economy, the mercantilization of art and literature, or the emergence of new subjectivities that still persist today. So this kind of new context marked until today, I think, the whole country. And we must take into account that officially, as María said before, the special period in Cuba did not end it. So it's kind of a ghostly temporality that haunts us today.
And I think I'm fascinated by your response. And I think one of the aspects that struck me in Elzbieta's book is how you don't have a sense of the failure of, you don't really have this, there's not this overlying failure of the narrative of progress, in part because of the special period and the way at which it, and its relationship to invention and how you discussed invention.
Yeah.
And that's ties into what you were. Thank you. And with regard to discipline?
Oh, it's a very question. I must think about it.
Me
because
too.
It's very broad, but it's very important to think about it. I could say, so far, it's very briefly, that at least change our relationship with objects of study, and especially with with people, with informants, because we must take into account a kind of other circumstances that rather than a textual dimension, the living experiences of people in Cuba are very important in order to narrate that period
Absolutely.
today.
And even very much so in your work, where, as you were just discussing it, it's sort of like an allegory of self, self-fashioning that emerges because the eye keeps on coming into these like vast interpretations of multiple archives. So I did want to ask you, just came upon so many documents in your work that I hadn't come upon before. The footnotes, the bibliography are just incredible. So could you talk about, I really want to know about your process of working with these immense archives. Journals that are not the journals that everyone easily has access to, but very particular, hard to find journals. Could you talk more about that?
Yes, thank you, Jackie. It's I think that at this stage of my career, I really see my work more as a service to the profession than, self-edification. So the fact that I was able to access and at the same time compile sources that are not as easily accessible to everybody, actually ironically enough, even to Cubans in Cuba, sources that appear and disappear on the internet. As we know, the lifespan of sources on the internet, except for this wonderful site, is short. So it was this kind of Benedictine work, which I knew that, may result in more, better, different, whatever additional work of younger generations. Some of it was also motivated by preserving. In other words, because it may be just one copy or, is deteriorating in some humid library somewhere, I felt that, at least there will be a trace of it. And coming from Poland, where so much of the material past had been destroyed, it's actually generation after generation of rebuilding ruins. I think, again, my personal narrative is somehow embedded in this. At the same time, it took time. It took a lot of time, and that's where the privilege comes in, the privilege of leisure. Because even though, I work, I teach, there was no, the sword of Damocles over me of tenure or contract or, renewing my position. If this book had taken 20 years, well, let it be. Especially since, as we know, the special period hasn't ended yet. So I had all the time in the world. So, so it was, there were moments where I just couldn't stop. I think it was also a fear of stopping. It's, there is this sense of when you produce a big project like this, that there will be this postpartum depression kind of phenomenon. So I think I was dragging my feet and looking for excuses not to finish. And actually, I should thank President Obama, because when he went to Cuba, I said, no matter what has ended and what hasn't ended, something has ended and something has changed. And when he talked about Cuban inventiveness, which is actually quoted at the end of the book, I finally was able to close it. So I think it's actually a configuration of so many things that I'm grateful for. At the same time, I am a kind of systematic person as an individual, so that also helps.
It's really not just, as you say, it's not just older archives. It's that you work up until the last minute. You feel that this book was published, that your work stopped a second ago, which is incredible, and which is. Se me fue. Okay, something about that.
Well, about archives, I don't know if we have time, but this is an anecdote that didn't make it, unlike the anecdote about the book cover, it didn't make it into the book. I was in Eastern Cuba, in Oriente, and there was a specific thing. I hoped I was going to find a little bit work, just sources beyond Havana. And that was the previous book that I worked on, the book on Haiti, and I had a wonderful encounter there with the archivists. But for this book, there was a moment of I mean, there were years of frustration where I couldn't locate the El Libro de Familia. I could get the Con Nuestros Propios Esfuerzos. It's now actually in PDF. And actually my gift, or maybe a curse for María Antonia, will be the PDF of the Libro de Familia, because she will hopefully put it on. I have the book now, and it took 6 years of, searching and searching, talking to friends. I remember Nancy Morejon saying, Elzbieta, you're kind of crazy. This book, nobody has this book. Nobody kept this book. It was the special period. The pages were soft. You don't ask me for what purpose the pages of this book were used. But I was persistent. And each year, whenever I went to Cuba, I talked to people and went to, the libreros de viejo and whatnot. And it was just to no avail. And in 2015, in March, I was in Cuba, and I went to the Plaza de Armas and made my circles and found someone who actually knew what I was talking about. And he said, okay, pero va a ser un libro caro. It will cost you. I said, well, I'm prepared. How much? He said, well, he looked at me and said, 30 cooks. I said, okay, why don't you try? So I went to the hotel and I gave him the information. And 2 days later, I was sitting in the hotel in the cafe with my graduate student who was actually doing research in Cuba on his own. And it was just like out of a spy movie, a spy who came from the cold or something. The waiter in this hotel kind of came and slid a little piece of paper to me. So I opened it, and I didn't read the whole thing because I got so overexcited. It said, Le tengo el libro. I have your book. So at this point, my body language exploded into the mixture of Caribbean and Slavic exuberance. And across from me, my student was saying, I said, Alex, I got that book. And Alex was just talking about his difficulties with archives. And I was just, all excited. And I asked for, rum or something, which is out of character for me. And then I said, okay, so let's read this note. And the note said, Estoy sentado a su izquierda tomando té. I mean, it's really like an English spy. What Cuban drinks tea? So at this point, I looked and I recognized, and I said, oh, Alex, to my student, I'm afraid the price of this book just tripled because he saw me being very excited. So we kind of, removed myself. We sat on the side, and he took the book out, and he said that he had to bribe an oficial de las FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias. Therefore, the price of the book will be 45 cooks, which I paid without complaining, and I have a copy. So, it was just one of those anecdotes which are kind of silly and, at the same time, actually very telling of what the process was like.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because as I said in that little transition, I mean, I felt like that moment in your book was so crucial and exploratory. And the generosity that you give in your talk today, talking about the testimonies and about that book, despite it being published by the Fuerzas Armadas, the importance of it and what we can take from it. And I see that in many of your discussions of anthologies, whether they be, no matter who is publishing them, there's a kind of tribute that you and respect that you have for what is written. María Antonia, I was watching the different publicity from the 1970s, of course, which I've seen, and up to Zulu, and the transformation from the Eastern European models to the model in Zulu, who was a Cuban woman of color. And so talking about sort of representational fashion and wondering, who is actually buying this sort of vintage-like handbags? Are they being bought by authentic Cubans, or is that a sort of publicity thinking about a wider market, or is this either or completely problematic in today's world?
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for your PDF. when I read your book, one of the things I want to read was the Libro de la Familia. I said I have to read it. Jackie, a few years ago, but I don't know, 2 years ago, Subano, Cuban intellectual, African American, now Cuban blacks call themselves African Americans as well, because Cuba is part of the Americas. Said that for blacks in Cuba, the revolution had not begun, and he had a lot of political issues in Cuba after that. He lost his job, actually. And I would say that for Cubans, the special period had not ended. Mm-hmm. So Zulu handbags are bought by tourists and foreign academics or Cuban Americans that visit the country, but the price ranges from $50 to $100 and something. So that's unaffordable for a Cuban.
Thank you very much. And Walfrido, so you you were talking about sort of diaspora in relationship to diasporic and exile without pathos, the post-human condition, and the resistance to identitarian representation. What does studying the materiality of diasporas tell us about this group's relationship to the narrative of modernity and the sense of progress that we see in María Antonia's work and in Elzbieta's work as well?
Thank you, Jackie. When we see the covers and back cover of the journal, what I think they are trying to transmit is the idea that in order to talk about those years, it is not mandatory to put in the back or cover jinetera or actually some transparent balseros or some that kind of new subjectivities. Mm-hmm. They are trying to talk about those years in other ways. You know, putting in the foreground the non-human figure, like the last covers, or other kind of figures of materiality of the journal itself. And the relation to modernity, I think there is in the first place we can think that this native diasporas is kind of coming back to something of I wouldn't say pre-modernity, but like it's an art that is trying to question and challenges the sense of futurity or futuridad or future of the Cuban Revolution itself, in order to to talk about death, non-productive things. I think it's kind of time perception in those years, because the time in Cuba it stops in those years for several people. They are trying to talk about these issues in several ways.
Thank you. Now, good questions from all of you? Yes.
So everyone's been talking about the special period topic here, and special period is the end of what happened in Cuba. What about the beginning of that period, before the end of it? What happens? Castro takes over and Russia comes in. What effect does that have on Cuban society, Cuban economics, social, artistic, cultural factors? Where does that actually begin to kind of solidify? And does it really change what becomes Cuba as we know it today?
Jackie, you're there.
Well,
You go.
in my talk, I try to give an idea of what came before the special period, and in my academic work, in my dissertation, actually, I conducted research on the politics of fashion in pre-special period Cuba, in Soviet Cuba, during the Cold War. And I argue that the material culture in general, but in particular fashion, helped to convey three main narratives: nationalism, egalitarianism, and modernization. So if you ask me what happened before, I would tell you there was a material order and a political order built upon these three major legitimizing discourses that helped to legitimize the Cuban post-revolutionary regime, or state socialist regime, as you want to call it. And well, I talk some.
And when does that solidify? When does that change? There's the period of Castro, when he first takes, the society changes, the revolutionary period. And then gradually the Soviet communist period is introduced. when does that begin to happen, and how does it actually affect the society?
In some cases, there was not that much change. In some other, it was a radical change. For instance, nationalistic discourses were not original from the post-Castro or Castro's era. You do research in the 50s and 40s and all throughout the whole 20th century. There is a whole tendency to convey nationalistic discourses through material culture, the way Cuban women dressed, the food they ate. They tried to eat, for instance, black beans instead of the Spanish bean, garbanzos, and black coffee instead of chocolate. So there was a whole movement to differentiate from the Spanish culture and create a kind of Creole Cuban culture. On the other hand, a lot of radical discourses like the use of war clothing in everyday life or the military olive green fatigue, they were quite new and they changed society and everyday practices and aesthetics. So it's hard to say, everything changed. Not everything changed, but something changed, other remained the same throughout the 20th century.
In my sort of newer work that takes off from my older work and also is in dialogue with María Antonio's very strongly, I'm thinking about sort of what is refinement and distinction. So sort of how, when you talk about the revolutionary garb and what it means to stand out, I think that sort of definitely transforms throughout the revolutionary period, which continues today. I mean, in a way, the notion of revolutionary period is very problematic in Cuban studies.
One of the proposal of Rafael Rojas, a historian, the cultural historian, in his book Historia Mínima de la Revolución Cubana, is that revolution as itself ends in 1976 with the institutionalization of the regime. As is, if you notice, the Cuban constitution actually is modeled according to the Soviet model. If you read all of the constitution, so he proposes that actually the revolution ends in 1976 with the solidification of the institutional framework of the regime in that case.
Nevertheless, it is frequently utilized, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what about the presence of religion? They're talking about the USSR and Russia. Russia with communism, there was an attempt to really destroy the religious heritage of the country, and after the fall of communism, Russia had kind of like a renaissance in religiosity and rediscovered its Christian roots. Do we have any manifestation of religious presence in artifacts and material culture, and what was the effect of the revolution?
You mean now, in the special period, or throughout the post-revolutionary era?
I would be interested in a timeline.
In the 3 decades that followed took over by Castro and the guerrilla. A lot of material culture and manifestations of religious faith were hidden or disappeared from domestic spaces in general. If you wanna be or pretend to be a revolutionary, it was not good for you that somebody came into your house and saw a Sacred Heart or something like that. Some people kept them, and proof of that is that after the special period and during the special period, a lot of Sacred Hearts reappear in domestic spaces, and so they were somewhere. But and so that's something that also happened in Eastern Europe in general, and in the Soviet Union in particular. The red corners, they were all, before the Soviet Revolution, they were used as a place of worship, and after the Soviet Revolution, they were used to worship the Marxist-Leninist ideology. In Cuba, it was not like that, but yes, the iconography, the religious iconography, was disappeared from domestic space, and it was substituted by portraits of Castro and guerrilla leaders, Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, or posters, political posters in general.
And yet, in cultural production, there are definitely references to religious practice, right?
Yeah,
I'm thinking viewed in sort of negative, atavistic sort of light. And what makes Cuba not civilized.
And I could make a differentiation between Catholic religions and Afro-Cuban religion, because the Afro-Cuban religion, you need actually some heavy materials in order to make it working. And, I mean, if you want to make a santo, you need animals, actually. And what do you get that? How do you get that in a special period? I don't know how the people make santo in a special period, because you need animals, actually. And the iconography and the guerreros, the words that you have when you kind of begin in the Afro-Cuban religion, is actually made of stones and some, how do you say, hierros, like irons, you know. So you need, I think you need another kind of material resources in order to enter or to practice the Afro-Cuban religion. Instead of a Catholic, you need a Sacred Heart, and I mean, you go to the church, and it's different. I could make a differentiation in this religion practice according to each religion, in a special period and beyond.
And also, prior to the special period, there was difference in which the state approached these Afro-Cuban religions as compared with the Catholic religion, because in the very early years of after the revolutionary triumphs, there was a fight, and that's the only word came to my mind, between the Catholic Church and the Cuban government, because the church participated in the campaign that took a lot of Cuban children from the families and brought them to the United States. So at some point, the Cuban government and the Catholic Church kind of didn't have any relation at all, and they were quite enemies, which didn't happen with the Afro-Cuban religions that were, during the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, kind of folklorized, and a lot of practices associated with the Afro-Cuban religion were incorporated into by the Cuban folkloric conjunto, group that, you know, they made theatrical representations and dances in public spaces representing the practices.
And Walfrido, to go with you, to talking about the special period and objects and materiality, there's also the remesas. You know, the diaspora actually coming in and supplying some of the materials that weren't there to continue the practice, and tourism being an important aspect of that in the 1990s.
And exporting.
But it's actually very interesting, just to follow up briefly, during the period of extreme scarcity, part of the rituals that have to do with Afro-descendant religions has to do with comidas de santo, the offerings of food that are very specific for specific, deities or orichas. And there had to be some adjustment made, because obviously these types of foods were just not available, and in a way, a dispensation had to be enforced as to not to offend the orichas in those moments of duress.
Hand has been up there for a while, and then
on this topic of religion, there actually are many artifacts that date from the period both under discussion and preceding that, that involve various Protestant denominations as well as the Catholic publications for various cities throughout Cuba. And because of the scarcity, they were often used, and I've looked at a lot of these. So one publication may go through dozens of hands, and they give an alternative view of Cuba, and it requires a way of reading these texts, which I find perhaps more analogous to reading some of the sound stuff from the Soviet Union that came out. Princeton Theological Seminary has, and as well as Princeton University Library, have really vast collection of this type of material, much of which has been microfilmed. And perhaps 3 decades ago, Princeton Theological Seminary, Harvard, the Divinity School, and the Yale Divinity School divided the world up. And Princeton does Latin America, Yale, Africa, and Harvard does Asia. So between those types of divisions, there was a great intensity of collections because funds were always available. So it may be worth looking at these types of communities, which are very important ideological, spiritual glue in keeping certain elements of Cuba together as members of the communities left and others would come and so forth. It's very revealing about the resilience, if you will, of the Cuban communities to withstand whatever was dished out to them.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering.
Actually, there was a,
in
I'm sorry, there was a question of one of these. Yes, thank you. And then you're good.
Elzbieta, it's about books. What year was published this Libro de Familia?
In 1991.
Okay, and about your book, and where can one get your book?
That has been actually a sore point, I must say. It's not on Amazon, but since it was published in Chile and was also a decision on my part to publish in Latin America and in Spanish, unlike my previous book, which was published in Europe and is available everywhere, but it's 4 times as much as this. There's a site online, it's called Busca Libre, and the mailing from Chile takes a while, but it's only $3.99.
What did it do?
Busca Libre it's like a site. It's like the Chilean Amazon, let's say it.
Okay.
And it arrives because I tested it a couple times. So that's for now the only way. But no me arrepiento. I think it was a good decision to publish it with them.
Thank you. And thank you for waiting. Yeah.
I was just wondering among the people who presented if anyone had an intention in their work to inspire any action, perhaps in Cuba.
What kind of action are you thinking of?
Well, you obviously took various approaches and you analyzed what was there. Did anyone have an intention that your work would inspire conservation, action, protest?
Since I am an outsider everywhere, coming from Eastern Europe, you're always an outsider everywhere. So it actually gives you a little bit more leeway, I think, than being a Cuban. But just to give you an idea, I have a friend who's Jacqueline, who's a writer now in exile, essentially in the U.S. His mom came to visit. She started reading the book. She's in her 80s now, remembers the special period very well. And she said, I'm not going to take this book to Cuba. I'm just afraid. And I don't think it's really an explosive or critical book. So it tells you also how, people perceive, you mentioned Tania Bruguera in the 1990s, a risk. What is the risk? So I think my approach when I deal with my colleagues and my friends in Cuba is never to impose anything, because they're ultimately the ones who take the risks. I don't. And if there's anything that can be done to preserve and also share information with them that otherwise would be difficult for them to access, that's probably the limit of my activism.
I think as academics, and I completely agree with Elzbieta's words, we are looking for the truth, and whatever people do with the truth we create is up to people. But in my case, I don't want to only change mentalities, which I don't. I just want to study a period that has not been studied and unearth the truths that have been unearthed before. But academia educates, and if I want to educate a public, it's not only Cubans but also foreigners, North American public, on how Cuban everyday life was lived back in the, because there are a lot of myths not only inside Cuba but also outside of Cuba, which I would like to help to dismantle.
Yeah, I can probably say, for example, that a version of this presentation as an article was published in a journal named La Noria, which is published in Santiago de Cuba. It's a few journal made by very young writers
they're having some problems with the state and institution in order to publish the journal because some of the themes they are trying to publish. But is one of the small way to to help to get know this. In my case, this journal that was prohibited was actually Samizdat in the 90s in Cuba, the diaspora journal, and this article was published there in La Noria, for example.
Thank you. No more questions? Well, thank you all for being here and your wonderful questions and your wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.